Thank you very much. Dear friends, it's an enormous pleasure to be here. The UN Association of the United Kingdom is one of the pillars of the support of the global public opinion to the United Nations, and the UK is also one of the strongest pillars of multilateralism and one of the most solid supports of the United Nations action around the world. So my first word is very simple. Thank you very much to all of you, to the British government, to the British people, to the UN Association. I could say, beginning this intervention, that the world has never been better than now. And it would not be very difficult to make the case with a series of arguments. But that is only part of the truth. So I would probably more properly concentrate on what I consider to be the three main challenges that we are facing in the world today, seen from the perspective of the UN, the kind of reforms that we need to be able to address these challenges, and the strategies that those reforms should allow us to put in place. First challenge is in relation to conflict. Again, it's true that we could argue that the world has never been more in peace than today. The number of soldiers killed in combat is at the lowest level ever. But it is also because the nature of conflict has changed. As it was said, we no longer have wars between countries. We essentially have internal conflicts with a multiplicity of actors of different natures, normally with asymmetric character, but internal conflicts that became quickly regionalized and sometimes even globalized. And those conflicts that have been multiplying in the recent years are more and more interlinked, more and more complex, and more linked to what it is now, a new global threat of terrorism that is impacting the whole world and cannot be neglected by anyone, anywhere. Now, why is it so? In my opinion, there are two main reasons for that. First, power relations in the world became less clear. And as power relations become less clear, impunity and predictability tend to prevail. Actors in different settings tend to do whatever they want, knowing that probably they will not be punished for that. And we see our behaviors of different actors in different conflicts systematically violate international humanitarian law, human rights, with the belief that nothing will happen to them, that there will be no accountability for their crimes. On the other hand, we see that in a context in which there is enormous progress globally, fragility has also increased in a number of relevant parts of the world. And fragility of different sorts. Fragility of political nature in relation to governance, corruption, institutions that are too weak to be able to make a country work and make progress. Difficulties in the relationship between communities of different religions, of different cultures, but also economic fragilities, the difficulty to respond to external shocks, be them related to climate change or to economic crisis. And this fragility that we see in so many countries in the world has been the cause for many conflicts to erupt, and then a major problem to allow us to solve those conflicts. Now, when one looks at this fragility, it's also important to recognize that even if the global economy has been progressing, and even if the global economic situation in the world has always improved, the truth is that we see a number of global megatrends that interact with each other, and interact with each other in a way that enhances those fragilities that I mentioned. Population growth, climate change, chaotic forms of urbanization, namely in the developing world, large movements of population, food insecurity, water scarcity. All these things are becoming more and more interlinked also in a world that is smaller and smaller, and they tend to have devastating consequences in different parts of the world, the most fragile ones, creating more sources of fragility and increasing the negative impact of that fragility in relation to peace and security in different regions of our planet. And at the same time, the truth is that we are witnessing a lack of trust between the general public, between peoples and political establishments, but also international organizations like the UN. Many people doubt that multilateralism is the solution for the global problems of this time. They think that probably the best way is to allow each country to do it by itself. And when one looks at globalization, it is clear that globalization has generated, together with technological progress, enormous increase in global wealth and in global trade, that globalization has had a very positive impact in the well-being of the overwhelming majority of the population in the world, that the number of absolute poor has been considerably reduced, but at the same time it is also true that globalization and technological progress have contributed to increased inequality, in some situations in a very dramatic way, and has left people behind. In all processes, there are winners and losers. And we have the rust belts of this world in which people feel abandoned and feel not only that globalization has worked against them, but that political establishments, international organizations have not been able to address their plight, to solve their problems, and they feel angry, and they express that anger in different ways, at national level, but also in different ways in relation to a clear criticism in relation to the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and other multilateral organizations around the world. Now, if we want to be able to overcome this lack of confidence, and to overcome this lack of confidence is absolutely crucial to rescue multilateralism and to make sure that multilateralism, that is more necessary than ever, as problems are becoming more global than ever, can move forward, we need to have a strong commitment to reform multilateral organizations. And one of those is the UN. And so I do believe that it is absolutely essential to introduce a very solid program of reforms in the United Nations. First of all, with the logic of integration. We are very segmented, we are very fragmented in the way we deal with the problems of the world. We have three pillars: peace and security, human rights, and sustainable development. But the truth is that these three pillars are dealt with in different ways, with different organizations, with different objectives, and sometimes even with contradictory approaches. It is for me absolutely clear that there is, and this is an old sentence, no peace without development, no development without peace. It is more and more recognized that there is no peace and development without human rights. But the truth is that there is no way to address these problems if we don't do it in an integrated way. If we are not simultaneously responding to the challenges we face in peace and security, in sustainable and inclusive development, and in human rights, and giving responses with our strategies, with our programs, with the action of our organizations that combine the three approaches into one single program of action. This integration approach must be the center of all strategies of reform that we implement in the United Nations. And in relation to that, we have three strands, but three strands that we want to make converge in one only line of reform. First, to reform the UN development system, to reform the way the groups of agencies that exist and that act everywhere in the world work together and are able not only to coordinate effectively what they do, avoiding overlaps and filling gaps, but that they accept a much more clear accountability, not only in relation to what each one does in accordance to its mandate, but in relation to what each one does to serve the objectives of the collective action of the UN in support to member states and in support to the Sustainable Development Goals, to the Paris Agreement on climate change, and the other very important instruments we have in order to make our planet move forward in the right direction. This is a central area, and linked to this area is the capacity to bring together the humanitarian and the development areas of action of the United Nations. Obviously, we need to preserve the humanitarian space and its autonomy. But it is clear when one looks at the situations around the world that it's essential not only to address the humanitarian crisis, but to build resilience of populations, of regions and countries. to create the conditions for those humanitarian crises not to be repeated. And the only way to do so is to link development with humanitarian response and to make sure that humanitarian response creates the conditions to be sustainable and not to force new crises one after the other, always making us respond in a way that might be effective in addressing the needs of the moment, but doesn't solve the problem of the people that we need to support. This coordination between development and humanitarian, that also means a much stronger coordination between the United Nations and international financial institutions and other multilateral organizations, is an absolute must in the way we are now looking into our reform process and the reorganization of the way we do business. But for this to work, we also need to look seriously into the architecture of our peace operations and of our structures that serve those peace operations. The UN is particularly known for its peacekeeping effort. It represents 70 to 80%, depending on the period, of the financial resources the UN uses. But the traditional peacekeeping blue helmet operation that was conceived for a situation in which the parties to the conflict would come to an agreement, and it was necessary to consolidate that agreement and create the conditions for stability in order for the country to be able to move forward in a positive way based on the peace that had been established. That formula is practically non-existent in today's world. And we have more and more peacekeeping operations where there is little peace to keep. And we have simultaneously, in the case of Mali, for instance, a peacekeeping operation together with a counter-terrorism operation. We have many situations in which we have to define a robust peacekeeping approach, in which peacekeepers are also supposed to fight against some spoilers, some terrorists or rebel groups that do not allow for a peace process to move forward. And this has created a number of challenges that put into question the normal way that the UN had to do business and the nature of the structures and the capacities that we have and the kind of partnerships that are necessary to face the new realities. And so another area of reform that is closely linked to the first one, because we need to align the sustainable development and the sustaining peace approaches. A second line is in relation to the architecture of our peace operations and the structural architecture of our political and peace dimensions at the Secretariat of the UN. And linked to these, we have two processes already in place with two proposals in the General Assembly. One, reforming our counterterrorism structure, linked to both counterterrorism and to the prevention of violent extremism. And second, a new program of action with important structural changes in relation to the sexual exploitation and abuse, as we recognize that independently of the dramas created to the victims, which of course are the first reason for us to act, this is also a most important source of reputational risk for an organization like the UN. It is totally unacceptable that those that are supposed to protect people are perpetrators of sexual violence in the context in which they operate. But for all these reforms to work, we need to make sure that our management processes change. And there is where we have the biggest difficulty, because if there was a conspiracy to make sure that staff rules, budget rules, financial rules were established for the UN to make the UN non-operational, if that conspiracy would exist, it had produced exactly the result we have today. The rules that we have to respect in the way we do business are the product of an accumulation during decades of situations of mistrust between member states that led to a logic of micromanagement in which, for instance, I am not allowed to create one position, a technical position in one office in Geneva, for instance, without going to the General Assembly and having the consensus on 193 countries. And the same to abolish that position. That shows how absurd our rules are and how needed is the reform, but how important it is to create among member states the belief that that reform is necessary, because for many member states this micromanagement capacity is something that they like to have because they give them the illusion of power. And as we know, those that have been in politics for some years, we know that sometimes we live much more with the illusion of power than with power itself. And the illusion of power has been a major motivation in relation to the absurd mechanisms that we have that undermine our capacity to act effectively. We need simplification, decentralization, we need flexibility, but we need transparency and accountability in what we do. And the kind of agreement I want to establish with member states is exactly that one. Give us more responsibility, give us more freedom of movement, but we are going to be more transparent and more accountable to you in relation to what we do and in relation to the forms in which we act. And the objectives for these are very simple. Reform is not something that we do for itself. Reform is something that we do in order to be able to have strategies that are more linked to the needs of the people we care for and to the aspirations of that people. And one of the things that is clear is that we need to substantially increase our capacity of prevention, of mediation, and of conflict resolution. And that requires an investment in our own capacities, an investment in partnerships with regional organizations. Tomorrow the African Union will be here together with us in relation to Somalia. Other regional organizations are extremely important. We need to be able also to work much better with the private sector and with the civil society in creating the conditions for prevention to be effective, because much of the prevention of conflict lies in economic and social development. Much of the prevention of conflict lies in the capacity of human rights to be respected, and we need to be able to put all those capacities together and all the actors that are relevant acting in cooperation in these regards. And at the same time, we need to be able to look into our peace operations and to create conditions for them to be more effective, more nimble, and with more capacity to use modern technologies, and with more links to the people they are supposed to serve in order to avoid the kind of abuses I mentioned, and in order to make sure that they become strong elements, not only solving conflicts, not only reestablishing peace, but creating the conditions for that peace to be sustainable. Then a second very important area for us will be to make the UN effective in supporting member states, especially fragile states or least developed countries, to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals are a very ambitious program. They correspond, in my opinion, to a breakthrough in the sense that it was possible to unite the international community with a universal vision and with a comprehensive approach to inclusive and sustainable development. But it's a complex process. It's not easy to explain, and it's not easy to use as a mobilizing tool in relation to all the actors that we need to bring together. Again, civil society, public sector, governments, international organizations. And the UN needs to have the capacity, especially at country level, with a much more coordinated and effective action at country level, supporting governments to make things happen, to make sure that the Sustainable Development Goals are integrated in the normal budgeting and planning processes of countries and are assumed by countries as their own national objectives. For that, we need to have a much more effective set of tools on the ground, a much more effective cooperation among our own agencies and the other actors in the economic and humanitarian fields. And this is the reason of the reform of the UN development system that I mentioned, and of the interlinkage between the development and the humanitarian dimensions of our organizations and of our actions. At the same time, there is a global battle for or against climate change, and a battle in which we need to mobilize all resources and all capacities. We see some doubts emerging, namely in a country that is extremely relevant for world affairs. It is absolutely crucial to mobilize governments to stay the course, to mobilize societies, to mobilize the business community. And I think that we have now a very important ally, because the green economy became the good economy, the profitable economy. Green business became good business. And this is one reason why I am optimistic in relation to the capacity, even when governments are doubtful, even when governments may consider that climate change is not a problem to deal with. I'm optimistic about the capacity to mobilize civil societies, business communities, cities, regions, all the other countries, in order to make sure that what was agreed in Paris is implemented and that we are able to face this very dramatic challenge that could alter in a terrible way the living conditions in our planet, especially in the most vulnerable regions of that planet. And one needs not do more but to look at the Sahel or to look at Somalia today and to see how droughts are becoming more frequent, more intense and with more dramatic consequences to understand that this is something that needs to mobilize the whole of the international community. And the UN needs to be able to make the case and needs to be able to work in support of governments and needs to be able to work in advocacy but also in the mobilization of resources that are absolutely essential for climate change. And then another crucial battle. We are seeing the human rights agenda losing ground to the national sovereignty agenda. And it is absolutely necessary to mobilize the international community, combining an approach that deals both with civil and political rights, but also with economic, social and cultural rights, and being able to do it with the conviction that human rights are a value in themselves and they shouldn't serve political purposes of any kind, but based on these two principles, mobilizing a new broader alliance for human rights, able to revert this trend that we are witnessing, in which the human rights agenda has been, as I said, losing ground to the national sovereignty agenda and facilitating the life of those that are violating in a horrible way the most basic rights, international humanitarian law, and namely in conflict situations, committing crimes against humanity, war crimes that one would consider should not be possible in the 21st century, but that unfortunately we are witnessing in many of the conflict situations in which we operate. And finally, we need to be able to address the questions of the future. When one thinks about the fourth industrial revolution we are living, it is clear that it will have dramatic impacts in the labour markets. And we know today how unemployment in certain areas of certain countries, and namely youth unemployment, has been a very dramatic factor, both for the well-being of people, for the development perspectives of countries, but also for the international peace and security. Recently, in a survey in relation to fighters in these conflict areas that came back, it was detected that the main reason, of course there are ideological reasons, all kinds of others, but the main reason that led so many young people to go and fight in remote places was the lack of opportunities. And if one sees the levels of youth unemployment in the Middle East, one understands how dangerous this is for us all. Now, looking at the evolution, the technological evolution, one can foresee in the next decades dramatic reduction in jobs in a number of functions that we today consider absolutely impossible to eliminate. Just to give an example, some people say that in a few decades' time there will be no drivers. You can imagine what this impact will have in the labour markets, in the employment situations, and what challenges this will put to governments and to international organizations and to societies in general. This is the kind of area that I believe we need to discuss much more seriously. We need to be able to anticipate the impacts of these changes that probably are inevitable, and to have the adequate policies at social level, at economic level, at international cooperation level, to make sure that this fourth industrial revolution will not become a dramatic factor of insecurity for our societies. And then we have areas that are having an enormous progress and in which both governments and international organizations have very little capacity to even understand what's happening and to regulate the way these things happen, taking into account that some of them have dramatic impacts even from the ethical point of view. I'm talking about artificial intelligence, I'm talking about genetic engineering and other areas. And one of the important things that we need is to discuss what kind of regulatory mechanism should we have? What is the role of governments? What is the role of international organizations like the UN? So there are a number of issues, frontier issues related to the future that we cannot just forget about. We need to be able to address the challenges of the present, but we need to be able to anticipate the problems of the future and to try to find for them ways of cooperation in which private sector, governments, international organizations can anticipate what might happen if nothing is done, but finding the solutions for the challenges that we could have in the future. And it's enough to see what's happening today in the cyberspace to understand how the level of unregulation of these factors can represent as a threat to our global peace and security. A strong commitment to multilateralism, a strong commitment to international cooperation, a strong commitment to put the people in the center of our concerns, but to do everything that is needed for the people also to feel that we care for them and that international organizations are not just a way to, I would say, discuss problems, but are an essential tool to address the present problems of mankind is something in which we all need to be involved. And it's very reassuring for me to be able to have this conversation in the UK, knowing that the UK is and will remain one of the most solid pillars of the UN and one of the most solid pillars of the understanding that there is no solution for global problems without strong multilateral institutions. Thank you very much.